my own report.
Okay, I got it.
You got it. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about the following things. It's a kind of complex lecture, but we got a lot to cover, and I'm just trying to get the basic energy facts for you to understand the world around you, and eventually for you to understand our economy and nature in general. So we're going to talk about the early Earth and even universe environment, the evolution of life, the particular role of the sun, the resetting the evolutionary clock with volcanoes and meteors, the importance of green plants, adaptations forced on life in an increasingly oxygenated environment, then what I call Hutchison called the ecological theater and the evolutionary play. Think about that in Ashland. The ecological theater, that is the ecosystem theater, and the evolutionary play. That's what happens over time. And the evolution of increasing biotic complexity. And finally, and this is something a lot of people like, measuring energy in an ecological systems. How do we actually go about measuring these things that I'm talking about? So we'll show you how I would do that with my students. Brief history of our universe. Wow. Supposedly there was a big bang, and we made hydrogen and then helium, and then in complex processes within stars, all these parts, these protons and neutrons and electrons would come together in increasingly big agglomerations that would make all the other elements, iron and oxygen and phosphorus and uranium and so forth. They didn't start all at once. They came together by conglomeration of other lighter components until we get to where we are today. Now, it is that may not be the origin of the universe. We don't know what was before then. We only get there by extrapolating the information we have today back as far as we go, and that goes at least 13.82 billion years to go back to the origin of life. And you can see all of these things. Galaxy evolution didn't happen until about 2/3 of time since the Big Bang. And here we are today, and we're just a galaxy within galaxies. Let me see, I got to move I'm sorry, it goes this way. Our solar system is a tiny spot in the Milky Way galaxy, and that's just one galaxy out of untold billions.
Charles, can we pause you for a minute? We need to mute Christian and anybody else. Christian's making quite a bit of noise. Thank you. Everybody else should mute as well.
I should have control of that, but I don't know how to do it. I should make, Richard, next time we should make you co-host and you can take care of these technical things, yeah. I think. Okay, so we okay now? Anyway, we're just a teeny speck in this enormous universe, and they took a spot in the universe where they couldn't see any stars or anything. It was just an empty spot from the biggest telescopes we had on Earth. And we looked in, then when the Hubble telescope got up there, which is outside the atmosphere, which allows much greater looking at things without atmospheric interference, they took the Hubble scope and looked at that empty spot in the universe, and they found billions of galaxies. Billions of galaxies. So we're so tiny in this universe, and statistically there should be many other planets out there with the conditions of life, but you know, so far we haven't seen any. And well, you can go and talk to people about Roswell, New Mexico, and so forth, who claim to have been abducted by aliens. But as far as we know, we don't have any evidence, what we would call official evidence, of any being contacted from outer space. Now, here we are at this gorgeous planet with lots of water and just the right conditions for life, but it didn't start that way. The Earth appears to have just accumulated a bunch of space debris 4 billion years ago. And it probably had water fairly soon coming in from water just existing here and there around the universe and being attracted to the mass of the Earth. So this is a bit debatable, but probably that we had oceans fairly soon. And probably at some time the Earth was smashed into by a Mars-sized blob. And this, we'll see the implications of that. Now, if we lived on this planet, we'd be dead in seconds. It would be anaerobic. That should be anaerobic. Ooh. It had no oxygen. Anaerobic, very poisonous to us, probably a lot of lightning. There was water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, nitrogen, ammonia, all kinds of things that would be either neutral or poisonous to us. No oxygen at all, a carbon dioxide content of 70% or more, completely different environment. Now, there were three main sources of energy for Earth. Radioactive decay, which is when matter is turned into energy using Einstein's famous equation, equals mc squared. That goes both ways. Geophysical, that means tides, and all kinds of volcanoes, all kinds of physical processes of the Earth and the sun. But these basically are all get their energy from radioactive decay. And radioactive decay is just something that happens from the original production of matter in the first billion years when all of these elements were formed. Some of them were what's called unstable. They don't have the right number of neutrons and protons, and so they decay to a more stable form over time, releasing usually protons, and that generates heat. So most of the energy source, one can argue, started with the Big Bang in the formation of complicated radioactive elements which keep decaying over time. I mean, if we wanted to dive into that, that would take a different lecture. So here's the sun, and for day-to-day activities, such as the weather, the sun is our major source of energy. There's a little dot, that's the Earth compared to the sun. And the sun is running, for example, our climates, our weather patterns, all kinds of things on Earth, including photosynthesis, which gives energy ultimately to ourselves. And we've talked before about how the sun is doing its thing, and green plants intercept some of that energy and run all the machinery of life. And all the free energy, that means useful energy that we had initially gets degraded over time into low temperature gradient work that cannot, low temperature gradient energy which cannot do work. And this is due to the second law of thermodynamics, which we touched upon before. Now, here are the main factors that have affected the solar energy budget on Earth, and depending on where you are on Earth. First is celestial mechanics. That means the mechanical doings of our solar system, Milankovitch cycles, continental drift, and CO2. So why do we have such a good climate? Richard, do you have a question, or is that?
Just a quick item is, how much do solar flares or
well, I'm going to talk about that.
Okay. Answer, I'll take my hand down.
Now, in a very interesting study, they asked a bunch of Harvard graduates why the Earth was warmer in summer. And I mean, they asked, 20 or 30 of them, and no one answered correctly. And here is why the Earth is warmer in the summer. It's because the Earth is tilted on its axis. It's spinning like a top, but the axis is tilted. It's not straight up and down. If it was straight up and down, summer and winter would be the same. But during the summer, our summer, in the northern hemisphere, the sun would shines above the Arctic Circle. It shines on June 21st, 24 hours of the day. But we get lots more photon flux, much more solar energy in the summer than in the winter. In the winter, we're pointed away from the sun. So we go around the sun like this, spinning daily, but also cycling around this ellipse once a year. And the sun itself is moving through space. So the Earth is kind of corkscrewing through space, following the sun. But we have a very structured and repeatable pattern that gives us the lovely seasons that we have. So here we are about the March equinox, March 21st, and where the day and night are equal. Now, in the southern hemisphere, December is summer. And so for many years, I would teach in the winter in Argentina. So I'd go from summer to summer to summer, or at least warm seasons, and avoid winter when I lived in Montana. Now, the actual timing and the processes of the movement of the sun relative to the Earth, relative to where you were on Earth, was very, very important to people in the past. And they would build very large observatories. Now, these are complicated structures, and they served other functions besides observatories. But you can see the passage of the sun, and apparently on December 21st, if you know where to stand in Stonehenge, the sun shines through some of these big stones and lines right up and tells you, okay, this is when the sun will start returning. And for people who are in cold England, this was very, very important to understand when that was. It was also very important to understand when to plant. And you can't tell that from temperatures. As we know, the temperatures go up and down very well. Here, incidentally, is the temple. We're looking from the Temple of the Sun. I think I've got this right, in Mexico. And what these are enormous observatories. And this is December 21st, the furthest south that the sun goes. And then you know, now if you know this information, if you have access to the pyramids, which the priests did, you would have tremendous power. Because you could tell people that if you sacrifice a virgin or whatever you did back then, that you could make the sun return. And the average person, how could they argue with the priest? And so this is one way that people gained power through knowledge. They said that their actions were controlling, they could call the sun back. If you do what I say, and I'll bring the sun back. And I've been up in pagodas in China, and on top of these pyramids in Mexico, and in big, thick-walled churches up and down California. The old ones, I have concluded that most of them were air conditioning for the elite, because when you go up to the top of these pyramids, the wind blows, and it's a lot cooler, especially if you have 4 slaves holding a blanket over your head so you don't get the direct sunlight. And that's what you see when you go to the museums in Mexico City. That an awful lot of this was air conditioning for the elite, but was hooked up with astronomical observations and various religious, quasi-religious, whatever they were, actions. They were basically just means of using knowledge to put other people under your power. Sound familiar? The Mexicans, this was Aztecs, had very, very sophisticated calendars. And there are ways that you can read this and make good predictions. Now, remember, it's very important to know when to plant. Because in subtropical areas, such as in Mexico, the rains come in the summer. And when you put in your seeds relative to when there's going to be rain was very, very important information. So that's probably why these people, many of whom were very sophisticated, did develop these very sophisticated calendars based on the relative movement of the earth and the sun. And here's a joke. I throw in a joke from time to time, but this guy is saying, best as I can decipher, it says we're going over some kind of a cliff. And in fact, these civilizations collapse for whatever reasons. If you're interested in that, then the best book to read is Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Economies. And who knows, we may be about to see that again. So here are things that affect how much sunlight or warmth a given location on the Earth gets. Solar intensity, which is mostly a function of latitude, Milankovitch cycles, and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And we hear a lot about this stuff now because many people think the climate is changing. So solar flares, the sun does seem to emit a few percent more energy when it has a lot of these solar storms. But as best as we can tell, and there are people who argue differently, but the general consensus is that the output of the sun over millions of years is approximately constant. It's called the solar constant above the latitude, above the atmosphere. Now, some people argue that these they certainly go in cycles. I think 11-year cycles or so of solar fluxes, but it's not strong evidence that it's directional. Just happens up and down. So this probably affects our climate, but I would say not very much is the consensus. Now, what affects it a lot more has been continental drift. Now, remember, I told you that we think that Mars-sized rock crashed into the Earth and threw out a bunch of debris that made the moon. That's one hypothesis. Seems to be pretty well accepted. Now, when they did that, they sort of unbalanced the Earth. So the Pacific Ocean is the hole that used to be filled by the moon. So it goes. And so that left the Earth unbalanced. And so the Earth, was once had all these continents were in one place. Now, this was some 100 million years ago, say. So when this guy named Alfred Wegener came up with this idea, it was because you find fossils that were distributed. The same genus would be found in Argentina and in South Africa, and even in Antarctica and in Australia, in the fern Glossopteris, for example. And what was especially interesting to me was Notophagus. So if I spent a lot of time in southern Argentina, and here's a picture of my wife's, many of you know my wife, Myrna Hall, fishing in Argentina. Oh, it had marvelous, marvelous fishing. And there would be beautiful mountains, the Andes, but there'd be all the trees would be Notophagus, which is southern beech tree. We don't have them at all here, but they have them in South Africa, they have them in Australia. So it was obvious to some that these all had been part of one area, and they weren't found in North America, they weren't found in Europe. So but there was no mechanism in 1950. They didn't know how it could happen. But then we started mapping the ocean floor, and we found this very complex, what is called a rift system. And it's where the ocean is spreading. So right in Iceland is the tip of this energy source. And what we've got is an energy source boiling up from underneath and pushing apart the surface of the Earth, called the lithosphere, rock sphere. And so if you look all around the ocean, all around the Earth, now that we've mapped it all with sonar, and you find there are these rift systems all over the place. So that's a source of California, for example, where various chunks of the Earth that came in and smashed into the location from this mantle spreading from the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So in a sense, all of this is ultimately rebalancing the Earth from the loss of that moon-sized chunk of stuff. And here are pictures of the Earth 225 million years ago, and 150 million years ago, 65, and nowadays. So you might see my maroon Prius around town, and it's got a sticker on the back that says "Reunite Gondwanaland." It sounds like a political statement, but in fact, Gondwanaland is what they used to call this collection of continents, and "Reunite Gondwanaland" is just a kind of tongue-in-cheek joke from one scientist to others. Now, this guy, Milankovitch, his name I had here. Yeah, Milutin. He was a Serbian scientist who lived, well, as you can see, 1879 to 1958. And he was obsessed with this from the perspective of the initiation of the ice ages. And he thought about you look at a top that's spinning, a child's top, or an adult if you're like me, and as it slows down, it precesses, it wobbles. The Earth is slowing down too. Don't worry about it. It's going to take a while, but the Earth is slowing down too from the friction of the tides. And so there are precessions that the location of the axis changes, the obliquity, what the axis, how much the axis is, and eccentricity, which is the degree to which the Earth's orbit is an ellipse versus a circle. And this guy was a mathematician who drove himself nuts trying to figure these things out from observations of the Earth. And he came up with these cycles over time that he believed caused the ice ages, and probably is pretty much accepted today as an important determinant of the ice ages. And so each of these things is operating independently, and you put them together. Now, I don't know if this happens with other people, but okay. Got rid of my pictures of faces. So here's what putting them all together, and this will affect the Earth and presumably ran the ice ages, among other things. So this is very important, and we're going to go in 1,000 years into an ice age. And so I have a colleague who thinks we should put the CO2 in the atmosphere to protect us from the next ice age. So we'll see. Okay, now CO2, that's an important determinant, as we all hear in the news every day, more or less. So we can get past or paleo CO2 derived from ice core. So you drill down into the ice core, and we have to get them now before the glaciers melt. And you can get CO2, you go down through time by going down through the ice core, and you smash it in special chambers, and you can derive how much CO2 the ancient atmospheres had, because there's bubbles of atmosphere in the ice. And you can get paleo temperatures from the ratio of oxygen isotopes. But, I wonder how many of you know that the CO2 is not the main greenhouse gas. And this is something, it's a bit of some bit of a conspiracy maybe, because CO2 is not the main greenhouse gas. It's not enough to drive the changes we appear to be observing. The main greenhouse gas is water vapor. Now, CO2 and water vapor interact in various ways, but I think we need a much more public discussion of the relation between CO2 and water vapor. Okay, now, if you look at from ice and other means, you look at that past CO2, the blue line, you see that the CO2 has gone way up. And if you look at the paleo temperatures, they look, boy, they're certainly correlated with the CO2. But again, this is a little bit dicey, because oftentimes the temperature changes before the CO2 changes. And if the Earth gets warmer, then CO2 will come out of the soils. and all of the detritus of the world. So it's not quite simple to say that CO2 is causing our climate change. It certainly has something to do with it, but it's a complicated system that we don't entirely understand. So people say, oh dear, the CO2 is much higher than it's been cycling in the past 800,000 years, and that's really true. It's gone way up since 1950, and I certainly think this is a dangerous situation. But now look, remember, this is going back not quite a million years, but if you look at this graph, which goes back 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, 400 million years, the CO2 tended to be considerably higher than anything we've experienced. We're up around here. And so the Earth has weathered no much higher CO2 in the past when dinosaurs and many plants were doing very, very well. So here's some ice ages. They're only recent. There was another ice age period way back. So the Earth's history is complex, and you go back further. It's not as simple as many of the discussions today seem to indicate. Let's see. Does anybody? We're going to make a big change here. Does anybody have a quick question? And I can't see you, so if this, here we go. Donna, did you have a question, or are you just putting your hand up? Oh, you got to turn your microphone on.
You haven't mentioned methane.
Methane is another greenhouse gas. Yes, indeed. It's much more powerful per molecule, but there are many, many, many more molecules of CO2. The problem with methane is there's all kinds of methanes that are in methane hydrates. They're called up in the Arctic zone that could be released, could be a big issue. Some argue. Others say, well, it's been a lot warmer in the past and methane did not prove a particular problem. I can't give you an easy answer. Again, I'd like to say that the reality is usually much more complicated than the current discussions in the media imply. Sarah, do you have your hand up? And would you like to turn on your microphone? And if you want the picture of yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. How did they estimate those CO2 levels on the previous slide from those former ice ages? How did they come up with
bubbles of atmosphere that are trapped in the ice? So when you go down, you're going back in time, and you take a thin slice of ice core. Do you understand ice core? You make a core going down through a glacier.
Okay.
Camp Century, Greenland was a famous place. And then you take slices and you put them in a chamber, a very special chamber that doesn't leak and made of non-corrosive substances and stuff. And you smash it with a special hammer, and the bubbles are released as atmosphere, they think.
But the ice doesn't go down to the
CO2 in that, and you measure CO2. You take a tube and you shine red light at one end, and then you have a sort of a meter to indicate the intensity of the light, and you also have a thermometer in there, and the degree to which the light that goes through it is turned into heat is proportional to the CO2.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
For the far back ones, it's sediments and sea level, I think, as much as anything to determine uh, temperature. Yeah, you didn't mention the
Yeah,
temperature
there are
when
other
those.
means as well, and the shells of little tiny
Yeah,
organisms called coccolithophores and stuff like that, all kinds of things. Rich?
Yeah, you mentioned that the Goandaland or whatever the mass
Yeah,
is called began breaking up. I think you said about 300 million years ago.
yeah.
The moon was forced off of the Earth much older than that, right?
Yeah.
So the Pacific Ocean just stayed as a hole in the Earth until 300 million years ago.
I can't answer that.
Okay, okay.
Okay, we got a lot to go on, so let's get back to the um now about 4 billion years ago, something truly big happened. Life. Now, is this the only place in all of these galaxies, billions and billions of galaxies, that there's life? Who knows? But statistically, there should be life in other places. Uh, but they're pretty far away. Now, how did life originate? Now, back in 1800, I want you all to transpose yourself into 1800. And everything you knew about the earth came, if you were in the Western world, came out of the Bible, out of Genesis, and God made it in 7 days and so forth. It was all in the Bible. And that's the only source of information they had. Now, this wonderful book, my wife just did it in her book club, and several people thought it was just marvelous. Not everybody. But Victorians, I mean, the problem was they would find these great big tracks, that were a foot or bigger, much bigger than any bird. They're bird tracks, obviously, but they found them in the mud. They found some near my uncle's in South Hadley, Massachusetts. And they found also these great big bones, huge bones, much bigger than elephant bones, or bigger than mastodons. They didn't know what it was. And this book is about how a series of just regular people in Elizabeth, oh gosh, what was her name? In England would make their living digging out fossils from the cliff sides in England. I should have put her name here. Many of them women, but they were not nobles, and so they were dismissed initially. But they started to find these unbelievable, clearly old skeletons. Important ones were plesiosaurs. Great big marine organisms we know now with flippers, obviously aquatic organisms, 30 feet long, that were just totally unlike anything. Now, the biblical view of all of this was that they were all drowned with Noah's flood, but they found them going back through rocks and rocks. And so where did all these things come from? Now, hypothesis one, and I put some cartoons in here just because I think they're a lot of fun. Divine intervention. And here's Gary Larson's, who's a very interesting cartoonist, that humans were generated by God one way or another. Hypothesis two is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin idea of, he wasn't the guy who came up with evolution, but he was the guy who came up with the concept of evolution by natural selection. One night he was reading Malthus, who said human populations grow exponentially and their food grows geometric. So there's always more people than food over time. And so Darwin got the idea that, oh my gosh, animals produce so many more young than they need to replace them. Which ones survive and reproduce? And that was the beginning of his idea of evolution by natural selection. And if there exists variation within a population, and that's obvious, you look around yourself on the human population, and if this variation is to some degree heritable, and we all look more like our parents, usually, than we look like other people's parents, and if there is differential survival and or reproduction among these variation, then natural selection will or must occur if these three things are true. And there's no question that these three things are true. So natural selection, there's just no way that you can say it doesn't occur. Now, you cannot, whether or not a God or gods has anything, can interfere with the direction of natural selection, is a question science cannot answer. But natural selection certainly occurs. The earliest life forms we know were microscopic critters, microbes of some kind, that left their signs of their presence in rocks some 3.7 billion years ago. And here's some reefs in Australia that are thought to be our earliest signs of life. Now, when photosynthetic, remember the first things weren't photosynthetic. They had to take their energy from some kind of existing energy source. Methane might be an example. We don't know very well. But then what happened some 2.4 billion years ago, in other words, a little bit more than half of the length of life, were that something truly amazing happened. And that was that critters could take the sun's energy to generate new energy-rich reduced compounds from water and carbon dioxide. They took water, hydrogen, and oxygen, ripped the oxygen off, took carbon dioxide, carbon and two oxygen molecules, ripped the oxygen off, took the water, took the hydrogen and the carbon and put it together and made sugars. And that's what these critters do. These are blue-green algae. Maybe that was like the first photosynthetic organisms, we don't know. And we take water and carbon dioxide and make sugar and have oxygen as a byproduct. And the plants would use these sugars for their own energy requirements. Now, what this did was it changed the whole environment. Now, I found, you can see this in many places in Glacier Park, but I found this rock, and it's truly amazing because the chemical composition of these rocks, there are layers and layers you see that are laid down over long periods of time. And the chemical composition of these rocks is the same. And they have a lot of iron in them. But here the iron is iron rusted. It's iron oxide. This has iron, but it's not been treated by oxygen. And so this is where plants evolved, where green plants evolved and turned the environment, the atmosphere, from no oxygen to the 20% oxygen, 21% oxygen that we have now. And you can see it in the rocks. It's just beautiful. Now, when oxygen came along in the environment, in the atmosphere, it wasn't a good thing because all the critters, it was very, very caustic. Oxygen is a very caustic element, and it combines with carbon, for example. And but nevertheless, all of these oxygen-required critters, ammonites and trilobites and so forth, evolved. Boom, and there we had it. Now, there was, in the Cambrian Ocean, we had an explosion of creatures. All of the major phyla that we have today, the basic life forms, about a dozen came into existence in a relatively short period, about 500 million years ago. Devonian later was the age of fishes. The world had all kinds of fishes and other, those are invertebrates. And here's an amazing story. This lady, Marjorie Courtenay Latimer, was looking through, she was a curator of a museum, and she was looking through a pile of fish, and she found this creature that was supposed to have been dead for 66 million years. But there it was, alive just a day ago, a day before, a great big fish. And so it's a living fossil. And when they took this creature and compared it with how it had been recreated from its bones, it was the bones were very good. Another important thing that happened was this guy, William Smith, who was a canal surveyor and geologist, and he found that each layer of rocks had its own peculiar fossils. So these were ones that were found in lower chalk, and these are ones that are found in upper duelite. I don't know what that means, but there's fossils that would be specific to each strata of rock and not to somewhere else. And then later in his life, he did quite well surveying canals and so forth. And he made this, I think I got a better picture here. He made this map of England. London's about here, but these are all the same fossils. In other words, these rocks in this color were all the same age. And he looked at them and he found it quite amazing. But then he made this little diagram here on the side, which all of a sudden made sense of this jumble of rocks. And here's what it is, that the rocks over on the west of England were old, were laid down first, and then these were laid down, then these and these and these, and then the youngest rocks were over here in the valley of the Thames. So these are old rocks here, and these are middle-aged rocks, and then these are young rocks. And all of a sudden, rocks were no longer just a random jumble of stuff. They made sense, thanks to William Smith. And we can now begin to understand everywhere in the earth what the rocks are. And if you go to the Grand Canyon, you can see them going almost the entire geologic record in the Grand Canyon. And here's a museum devoted to William Smith, where all of this stuff can be found in England. Marvelous, marvelous stuff. So we have the evolution of life. Cambrian, when all the major life forms were found, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and so forth, going all around until relatively recently. And humans are just a tiny, tiny fraction of this. So the Earth's been around a long time, and a lot has happened. The people who figured this out, James Hutton, the Scottish Enlightenment, father of modern geology, he thought, And he came up with the idea of uniformitarianism. What is happening now was happening then. The Earth is very old, and all of these were put into books, Principles of Geology, that by Charles Lyell. You know, there's lots of famous scientists named Charles, and lots of mediocre ones too. But anyway, here's Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Now, the idea of uniformitarianism then was challenged when people found suddenly something happened, and you would have a tremendous resetting of the ecological clock. For example, 66 million years ago, in apparently one day or week or month, all the dinosaurs went extinct except for the birds. Birds are dinosaurs. Boom. All of these, the Earth was just full of these big reptiles, and they went extinct in one day. Or some people think that sometimes giant volcanoes, really big volcanoes, have blocked out the sun for long periods of time. And so that was a new. It's both uniformitarianism and catastrophism both happening. Now, when I should have put this earlier, but one thing that they found when just 10 years after Darwin's book came out was this fossil of a critter with a tail like a dinosaur, and bones pretty much like a dinosaur, and teeth like a dinosaur, but very obviously wings and feathers. In other words, it was some halfway critter, a missing link, so to speak, between birds and dinosaurs. They found this is called Archaeopteryx in a limestone quarry in Germany, and oh my, this gave a great deal of support to Darwin's theory to many people. And from these beginnings, all of life have apparently evolved. All of us have ancestors going way back. I don't know where you start on this graph, but plants going out here, and bacteria, archaeobacteria, animals starting here and going off in different ways. And well, I'm not going to try to unravel that. Oh, and here we are up here in our relatives. And we cannot say that humans are the quote unquote highest, most evolved critter, because there are many parasites that live only on humans, and hence obviously have been evolved since humans came along. So all the different groups are still evolving. And the simplest sponges are also evolving, maybe not very rapidly, but they continue. And here's a little cartoon for those of you so inclined. Just think, the Earth was a cloud of dust 4.5 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago. The first bacteria, and then came sea life, dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and finally, a million years ago, man. Now in 1988, there's me, the acme of evolution, which the tiger certainly doesn't think is true. Okay, let's look at the distribution of life. If you hold your hand up to the sun like this, you feel the intensity of the sun. It's called high photon flux density. As you tilt your hand, you feel it less and less until, if you point your fingers at the sun, you don't feel the sun at all on your palm. So the angle at which you face the sun determines how much solar energy, i.e. the photon flux density, you get. So the sun heats the equator mostly, and so the air masses on the equator heat from this sun, and you can see it on maps, wonder maps, if you have that kind of weather reporting. You can see the clouds boiling up in the late afternoon in the equator, the thermal equator, which goes north and south with the seasons, and that pushes the air masses up, and as the air masses go up, they cool, and the air has less energy to hold the water in suspension, and it rains. So where does it rain? It rains where the sun is directly overhead. So that will be on the real equator about now. So they're starting to have rains in the Congo and Amazonian basin about this time of the year. Now, what this guy George Hadley figured out in 1780 was that the air masses would accumulate in the upper atmosphere and move north and south and cool enough by about 30 degrees to decline. So you get these circles of air movement at the equator, north and south, and you have and you get air masses that are rising on the equator, descending and making a high at 30 degrees north and south, and that pushes the air masses towards the equator. But because of the Coriolis effect, these air masses look like they're coming from the east. And this forms what are called the trade winds. And this was so important. We'll have a special part of a lecture later on this for early sailors in figuring out how to get where they wanted to get, how to get from Europe to the Caribbean or South America, for example. You have to understand this. And George Hadley gave the world that understanding. We have mid-latitude cells, not quite as strong, but pretty strong here, and going in the opposite direction from the high pressure at 30 degrees to lower pressure at 60 degrees. And that gives us the westerlies that provide us in Oregon with our weather. The whole United States pretty much has westerly winds. Here's another rendition of this, the trade winds near the equator, and then the westerlies up where we are. And this all moves north and south with the seasons. Whew. And that determines where vegetation is. So the vegetation is most intense on the equator and least intense at 30 degrees north and south. So Australia is a vast desert because it's at 30 degrees south. Now, that determines throughout the world the basic pattern of vegetation. There is a lot of water here, very little water here, not much water in the western United States, a little bit more up in the boreal regions, and the vegetation responds accordingly. We have lush tropical biomes, deserts where there's little rain, savannas where there's enough rain for grass and a few trees, and taiga or boreal forests when you get up into Canada and in northern Russia. Now I've been an hour and 5 minutes and I've got a lot to go. Anybody care whether you want to stop and have questions, or should I keep talking? I got a one person wants me to keep talking, which I will do. Okay, I'll try to get through this. So I'm going to talk about ecology now. I'm an ecologist, a systems ecologist, and the background of systems ecology started with this guy Arthur Tansley, who came up with the term ecosystem, contraction of ecological and system, and used it to define a unit of land that covers all organisms of a given area, as well as their inorganic environment. And this guy, George Evelyn Hutchinson, who's my academic grandfather, he trained many of the ecologists of a generation ago. One of his students started the whole thing, and the most original, perhaps initially, was Raymond Lindemann. He was the first to conceptualize a unit of nature not as a group of species or populations, but as a tightly linked trophic structure. Trophic means food. And he worked at this place called Lindsay Pond. I'm sorry, this was Cedar Bog Reservoir in Minnesota. And he called his approach the trophic dynamic or food changing approach to ecology. And he came up with 4 main points by looking at the data he had. Ecosystems could be conceptualized as trophic assemblages as well as species. Energy flowed from the sun to primary producers to herbivores to a series of carnivores. The transfer of energy was roughly 10% at each level, and he thought trophic efficiency appeared to increase with trophic level. That has not held up well, but the other 3 have. So if you're eating a tuna fish, you're not getting very much of the energy that was formed the basis of the ecosystem, because the tuna fish is about 7 trophic levels up, each of which gets only about 10%. Now, another of Hutchinson's students, well, not just one, but was my advisor, Howard Odom, and came from quite a distinguished family. And he came up with a series of very innovative and clever ways to quantify and represent metabolism or energy use. Metabolism means the use of energy, including the diurnal oxygen curve method for analyzing photosynthesis and ecosystem flow diagramming. So I'm going to show you how you do it. One way you can do it is just harvest the amount of material and figure out the energy content of it. We're doing this in a salt marsh. That's a square meter, what's called a quadrat. Or you can measure gas exchange, how much CO2 the plant is taking in, how much oxygen it's giving off. Here's my technique for getting a quadrat of fish. That was a lot of work to do all this. Okay, so I'm going to show you how we did it with a class. So I did this maybe 40 times in my academic career. And I was teaching a course in modeling. Most people teach modeling from equations and go from there. But I did it very differently. We would go out to this beautiful little stream in upstate New York, Little Sandy Creek, and tributary to Lake Ontario. And we'd go up and there'd be, by the time we're done, 3 times as many tents and set up for the weekend in September at the beginning of the class. And remember, this is a modeling class. And we'd usually have about 30 students. We'd have a professional cook so the students could concentrate on all the work. We had lots and lots of different equipment, which I'll show you. and mostly the students would get there and they'd have no idea what's going on. We set it up as a military unit. So we would have 6 different platoons, and I was the general, and these were the lieutenants. Omar, for example, is Lieutenant Fish, and I can't remember her name, was Lieutenant Chemistry and Lieutenant Physical and Lieutenant Bugs and so forth. They do each of the what needed to be done in the class, and we'd start with a soliloquy that I would give on the first evening, and then I would tell them what it's all about, what a system was, how we measured systems, how we thought about systems, and even though they didn't quite understand this, how this was going to eventually relate to their ability to make computer models of nature. And ESF, Environmental Science and Forestry, that's where I was teaching. And much of what we did was with what are called winklers. Winklers are a means of measuring oxygen, and I'm showing them how to do that. We have students from all around the world. This girl right here, I remember, was from France, went on to become a distinguished ecologist in France. So here I'm showing them how to do the chemistry, and if you've done titrations, you understand what we're doing. But the first thing to do is to measure the physical units, and my wife took the course. The first year we were married, it almost ended our marriage, but anyway. And she's studying the rate at which the water moves downstream by following lemons. And here is other years, some students doing the physical team, measuring the width and the depth at 10 locations going across, or every 10 centimeters going across the stream, and the water velocity. That's what this thing is over her shoulder. It would, if the weather cooperated, it was gorgeous. It was glorious. We had a farmer who loved to have us on our farm and would keep the area mowed. So it was a very comfortable place to work. And here's a student out doing a winkler in the water and studying how much photosynthesis there is. Here's another student from China, and she's taking the water from a winkler bottle and titrating it to tell how much oxygen was in it. And we do 100 or more different oxygen measurements. And also, as you see, we'd have samples of the insects, and there's students that are working to identify the insects that are in the stream and so forth. And here's another device, a benthic chamber for measuring the energy use. And you just see this little glint of golden green. That's diatoms, and that's providing the energy that runs the whole stream, that all the fish are ultimately dependent upon these algae on these rocks. And underneath the rocks would be insects. Oh, here's another benthic chamber. We'd always get some big trout under that bridge. Everybody was excited about that. Here's some ladies that are measuring how many insects there are per, I think it's a square foot, English units of you put this net fits into this device, and you take all the rocks from the square foot and rub them with a toothbrush and catch them in here, and then later identify them. There's a stonefly, so there'd be hundreds and hundreds of insects that would be under these areas. Here's measuring fish. You block off a section of stream, and you go through with electricity, a special device, a fish shocker, and you'd measure each of the fish. You'd get 100 fish from a section of stream like this. It'd be 100 or more fish in that area, and so they're all the students that are dealing with it very carefully. And then we put individual fish into buckets and measure their oxygen use. So we'd measure the use, and we do it with the insects. We do it with all the creatures. Look at the energy use of each creature. This was my teaching assistant, Jerry. He did this for many years, and now makes the computer models that regulate all of the water supply for New York City and meets all of its environmental requirements, and he's the man. He was just a great computer programmer. Well, there's a nice brown trout and a rainbow trout and some suckers. Just some of the fish. There's a yellow perch that we got in. Then we published this. So anybody who cares about this and in detail, it's all been published, and I'll send you the paper. And we make the flow diagrams going from how much energy comes in from the sun and how much goes into the benthic community, the herbivorous invertebrates, the insectivorous invertebrates, the insectivorous fish, and the piscivorous fish. And basically, you have a decline of energy going through all of these different components until it's all turned to heat. Woo! Okay, I'm going to stop there, and that's how you do it. You can actually go out there with a team of people and measure the energy use of the whole ecosystem and all of its parts, and it's just amazing. So there we have it, and I'm trying to get out of here. How do I get out of here? Oh, stop share. And so if you want to know how you measure energy in an actual ecosystem, that's how you do it. So who's got a question for me?
Did you eat the fish?
No, we have a rule that in general, you do not eat your research fish. But, and I actually have a picture of this. Sometimes I'd stick a fly rod in the back of the car, and when we're all done, sometimes I'd go fishing, and yes, we'd catch a few fish and we'd eat them, but they were not the research fish. No, that's not considered kosher to eat your research critters. But they were very good.
Did you document fish eating bugs? That kind of thing?
Yep. Well, what we do is we calculate, you take a trout and you put it in a cooler, and you'd measure the oxygen in the cooler, and let's say it's 10 parts per million. And you'd put a thermometer in there and measure the temperature. And then you'd leave the trout in there for an hour or two, and you come back and measure, and it'd be 7 parts per million. So you could, and you cover it with saran wrap so that the water wouldn't interact with the air. And you come back and you put the whole tub into the stream, so it would be at the temperature of the stream. And you'd fill it with water from the stream. And you came back and the oxygen would be less. And then you could go through the mathematical convolutions and figure out how much oxygen the fish used per unit time. And then we take the same fish in the same cooler and we cool it with ice, and we get it down to, say, 15 degrees. It might have been started at 20 degrees, get it down to 15 degrees and maybe later to 10 degrees, and measure the oxygen use again. And the fish would use less oxygen per unit time when the temperature was colder. So you'd get what we call a response function, a response of the fish's energy use, which is proportional to its oxygen use, per unit time. And so we do that also with the insects. We just put a bunch of mayflies into a Winkler bottle where we knew the oxygen and look at how much oxygen they use per time. And the smaller the critters are, the more oxygen they use per gram per time. And then what I do is I'd have the students, I mean, they'd be exhausted from a weekend of doing this. And they'd try so hard to be very, very careful. They were very, very, at our environmental college, they were really wanted to know how to do these things. So they'd work really hard to get the numbers as good as we could. And then we'd teach them the first step in modeling would be to take their own data as teams. They'd all work as teams and to put it so the computer could read them. And then I'd give them an assignment. I'd say, okay, how much energy would that fish use over a day? And so they just figure it out per hour and then multiply that by 24. Then I'd say, okay, now the temperature changed in the stream from 20 degrees to 22 degrees and then down to 18 degrees. Calculate how much energy that fish used as the temperature changed over that day. And then do that. This is 1 week and the next week and the next week. They say, okay, how much energy did that fish use over the year? Then how much energy did that fish use over the year if it grew at such and such a rate? And then how many bugs would the fish need to eat? So we did all of that. And whoever asked me that question, if you want, please send me an email and I'll send you our studies where it shows you how we did that. Chall, CHALL at esf.edu. Okay, whoever it was, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Rich?
Charles, you haven't mentioned one of my heroes, Aldo Leopold, and I'm not sure how much he got into energetics in the ecology. Could you comment on that?
Well, he was an inspiration for all of us. And there's a paragraph in his Sand County Almanac about following a molecule of phosphorus as it went from the rock to the soil to the plant to the, I don't know, to the human down the toilet and whatever, out into the ocean eventually. So he was certainly, you know, all of us in ecology are pretty strongly based in natural history, or we hope to be. And again, as in observational science, and then how do you quantify it? And then what do you do with it once you've got that? So, and some people have done the same thing, you know, for humans. So if you could take the city of Ashland and 20,000 people and look at the energy use per day and calculate how much, and then how much of what we eat is at what trophic level, and ultimately calculate how much petroleum, for example, we need to do to make the fertilizer to grow that much food and run the tractors and stuff. And I've written lots of papers on that and quantifying it. Again, I can give you the actual papers if you want, and I'll talk about it in about the 6th lecture or so. I'll talk about some of those things and show you how we go about doing that. But this is to give you, I mean, for me, I look at an ecosystem and I look at a human society and I see the same patterns. Different rates, of course. And of course, humans use petroleum to accelerate their extraction of stuff from nature, and to get more nitrogen, especially. Mary Ellen, switch your microphone on.
Yeah. What was the prime predator in that system?
Oh, the top predator. We'd usually have an ornithologist in the group. And and we had the top predator was a kingfisher, who was almost always there, and occasionally a great blue heron. But given that, neglecting that, and they were so small in biomass compared to everything else, that normally there was a couple of fair-sized smallmouth bass, and when the trout got much bigger than this, they go down to Lake Ontario. So we didn't have, we had big salmon that would come up and spawn, but they weren't eating while they were up there. So the top predators were the rare birds, and the kingfisher was generally there, and he'd cheer us all up with his cry when he'd come flying up by. But when you figure out how many grams of kingfisher there were per square meter of stream, it wasn't very much. So, this completely changed my perspective being a fisherman all my life. And then you realize that the fish are not a very important part of what goes on. Most of what goes on is those little bit of golden diatoms on the rocks and the microbes. That's the most important stuff going on in a stream. And I found that kind of interesting. Come on, give me one more question. We got 4 more minutes.
I have a question, which is how did you measure? Obviously, the photosynthesizers were the primary producers. How did you measure them accurately? And also, actually, adjacent to that, how did you manage things like?
I don't understand the question. How do I measure the fertilizer used by the farmer?
No, how do you measure the primary producers, the amount of energy they capture in that area?
On a farm?
No, in the stream.
Oh, well, maybe do you remember the boxes on the bottom, the benthic chambers? Do you remember that picture?
Yep, I do.
So there's these boxes that would isolate a section of the stream, and we had a little motor that would simulate the current going around it, a little outboard bilge pump, and we'd put in an oxygen meter at different times and measure the rate of change of oxygen over time. So when the sun was shining, the oxygen would go up, and that would be proportional to photosynthesis. And you can convert from oxygen changes, milligrams per liter, you can change that into kilocalories or into joules, and that's what we did.
See, so oxygen was the proxy the whole way through.
Yes, we measured energy use with oxygen for every critter, because now it's a good point. There's some anaerobic energy use, I suppose, in the stream that we did not measure, but it's people have looked at that. We did that one year, and it's very small, but we just by the oxygen use. Now, how we measure it in agricultural fields, mostly we look it up because there are all kinds of people at our agricultural colleges that have lots of data on that. And, just as a little aside, something about this is quite amazing. If you plot the production of maize versus latitude, let's see, I guess I got to start over here. It's U-shaped. I got to go this way. It's U-shaped on the equator. I worked a lot in the tropics, and the production of maize or corn, what we call corn, is very low in the equator, never more than 1 or 2 tons per hectare per year. In Iowa, you can get 10. I suppose in Oregon, you might get 6 or 8. And it's a function of latitude. And it's because during the growing season in the tropics, all year round is the number of daylight hours to night hours is always about 1 to 1, 12 hours daylight, 12 hours night. But in Iowa, when you're growing corn, it's 16 or 17 hours of daylight and to 8 hours of night. And during night, a corn plant uses its own energy for its own maintenance metabolism. So during the growing season, in the mid-latitude, temperate latitudes, you get much more, you get twice as much relation of production to energy consumption of daytime when photosynthesis occurs to night. And so that's an amazing thing. One reason why that people don't talk about why temperate countries tend to be much richer is that their agricultural production is 5 or 10 times more than in the tropics, simply because of the daylight to nighttime relation. Do y'all follow that? It's in the tropics, you don't have long nights. It's always about 12 hours. So these
But in the tropics, can't you grow all year round? Whereas in Iowa, you've got a growing season?
Yeah, but the production is such that over the whole year, you still only get 1 or 2 tons per hectare per year of grain, of yield, compared to 5 or 10 for the growing season in Iowa.
Okay.
It's amazing. So these basic energy relations are extremely important for many things, including the productivity of our agriculture. And I never hear that from agricultural agents.
Well, there's another thing, Charlie. The soils in the temperate region have all this organic matter stored up in the soils, whereas in the tropics, it leaches out and oxidizes quickly. So the soils are much poorer. And most of the biomass is in the living stuff in the tropical forests and so on.
That sometimes tropical rainforests do have a lot in their soil. But a more important thing is the fertile soils are new soils. And that's volcanic or glacial or from rivers, riparian. And so much of Europe and the United States, for example, was glaciated, and that made all the soils new. And so we're starting all over again. So, for example, all of South America has hardly any phosphorus. It's been pretty much leached out, rained out. I agree with you that how long the soils have been exposed to rain is probably the most important index of their fertility. But all of these things are what we call biophysical, are based on the physical things that you can understand that lead to higher or lower productivity. I studied this in great detail in Costa Rica and made a lot of different graphs and maps that explain this stuff. And it was beautiful, actually. I don't know, anybody interested in that? I just published a piece on that. So I've got it in a very good 4-page summary. Well, that's some ecology. Now, anybody, all of these are recorded, and we're going to put my PowerPoints on, thank you, Elaine. All of these are on my going to be on a site, which I don't quite think we've established. Melissa, I know you've looked at least one of the recordings, I think, and maybe somebody else has. And anybody have any problems, then you even have my telephone number if you need to call me. And next week, we're going to go into looking at the ecology and evolution of humans. You and me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would be interested in that paper that you were just talking about.
Okay. I've got your, all right. Will do right now.
Thank you. Bye. See you next week.
Hmm?
Oh, see you next week. Thank you.
See you next week.